Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are jumping into Heroes Reborn issue 1 with the return of Mephisto's Justice League. And with this happening, it feels like we're getting a continuation from a long time War of Realms cliffhanger. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch our spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so getting into Heroes Reborn, we're dropped in through the narration of Blade. And when we jump in, we're thrown into this world where Blade, he tries to reach the Avengers, but no one picks up at Avengers Mountain because it's not there. But with us getting much of this from Blade's perspective, with us looking through the eyes of someone who's new to all of this, much like us, for the most part. Because in this world, the Avengers are missing, and the main heroes are the Squadron Supreme of America. And a lot of this feels like what we had seen from Mephisto during War of the Realms, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when we jump in, we initially start off with narration from Blade, who has woken up in this world or reality to where at this point he's been here for about 2 weeks. And when we initially find him in East Los Angeles, he's confronting Robbie Reyes and he's asking him like, I'm looking for the Ghost Rider. But this Robbie, he doesn't recognize Blade, he has no idea what he's talking about because he's never been Ghost Rider. And with the way that Blade asked him, like he initially thought that Ghost Rider was like a new drug on the street. And I'm pretty sure like the sound of Blade's voice didn't help either, because you know, he just said, hey, I'm looking for the Ghost Rider. So Robbie just took off on his bike, he said no, like he just dared to be different in this universe. But after this, we then go to Washington DC, like days later, to where we go to the White House, to where Dr. Doom has just pulled up with the Crimson Gem after recently losing Latveria. But with doing this, he mentions that he's taken the gem straight from the tomb of Sidorak, which means that Cain Marko had never became Juggernaut. But in this world, rather than Cain Marko, Dr. Doom had taken the Crimson Gem of Sidorak and he had become the Juggernaut instead, using this new power to overthrow Western civilization and using the gem to convert himself into pretty much a one-man army. But before he can level the White House, he's immediately confronted by Hyperion. And for Hyperion, who really needs no introduction aside from just Superman in Marvel Comics, like there's no other way to put it. But when we see him here, he's very much the Hyperion that we're used to. And I mean as far as same identity, Mark Milton, same powers, super speed, strength, flight, shoots atomic beams from his eyes. But even with as similar as he is to the Hyperion that we know, like the scale of his strength in comparison to this Doom or Dr. Juggernaut, like it's ridiculous. And as far as like any debates or a comparison to Hyperion's power versus the Crimson Gem, like I would not recommend using this instance, because once you step into the whole manipulated reality type thing, like nobody wins that argument. But after this, when we then jump over to Nighthawk from the Squadron Supreme, and it's like from here where we really start to get like the Justice League vibes, which we kind of already got from Hyperion, with him verbally being more Superman-like. But aside from that, everything else about Hyperion has always been very Superman-like. But as far as the rest of the Squadron Supreme, we jump over to Nighthawk, and in this world, he's not wearing hockey pads, like he's Batman. He got the Night Jet, he has his version of Batarangs, and over here, he's even referred to as the world's greatest detective. But here's the thing, because we had also seen this before back in Jason Aaron's run of Avengers, during War of the Realms, because back at the time when the Frost Giants attacked the nation's capital, they were then stopped by DC's greatest heroes. And at the time, of course, they meant Washington DC, but even still, clever wordplay on the part of Jason Aaron. But even then, when this had happened and we were introduced to not just the Squadron Supreme, but the Squadron Supreme of America, like back at the time, this was still occurring within the main Marvel universe. And when we had seen this take place, it was like one of the many things that Mephisto was doing while he was pulling strings from his cell in Las Vegas and using Philip Coulson to assemble this team in Washington. And back at the time when this happened, and once again, smaller scenario, it was really just this team. But when this happened, T'Challa, he sniffed it out and he confronted Coulson about it, to where then Coulson called in the Squadron Supreme of America to arrest T'Challa, and T'Challa was pretty much like, no, you ain't finna do that. But even then, T'Challa had recognized that this wasn't actually the Squadron Supreme, and it was physically them, yes, but as far as their memories and who they had believed themselves to be, like it had all been fabricated by someone else. And back then, T'Challa let them know, like when you start asking questions and Coulson stops answering, just remember that the Avengers are not your enemy. But yeah, like as far as what we're seeing from the Squadron Supreme of America, it very much seems like the continuation of what we'd seen in Avengers issue 18, with Mephisto pulling the strings and Philip Coulson spoon-feeding the memories to mold this team into a new image. And if I'm not mistaken, like the last thing we had saw from that, like with Mephisto, who was still in his cell at the time, was him saying like with all the strings that he'd been pulling, like with Tony Stark and like his plans for Moon Knight and Ghost Rider, like he was pretty much just going to move forward, making moves on everything. Which is pretty much what I believe is the case of what's going on here, but just on a much larger scale. But with getting back to Heroes Reborn, we then follow Nighthawk, which takes us over to the Capitol building, to where we then find the Black Skull, which on one hand is the Venom symbiote, who's possibly bonded with the Red Skull, and when Nighthawk goes after him, we find out that a number of threats have escaped from the negative zone, which is why all of this chaos is just breaking out at the same time. But as we continue to pan through and Blade continues to narrate, it's here where we see not only that the Avengers are missing, but also a number of the members had never became heroes at all. Like there's no Doctor Strange, Jennifer Walters, she never became She-Hulk, Bruce Banner had long been taken to the negative zone, which had taken the Hulk out of the picture, and for as long as anyone can remember, the Squadron Supreme, they've just been the world's mightiest heroes. And as far as up next on the Squadron, we see Dr. Spectrum, who much like Hyperion, he looks the same and his powers appear to be the same, except in this case I believe he has a bit of a super soldier origin. But aside from that, he looks the same, he has flight, he makes energy constructs, which I guess makes him the Green Lantern of the team. But when we see him, he's heading into space to get a better view of a bigger threat that's much further out, while telling Carol Danvers, who had never became Captain Marvel, to stick with the Delta team and cover the airspace over the Pentagon. And when this happens, we see Tony Stark watch Dr. Spectrum leave the atmosphere. But in the case of Tony, he's still pre-Iron Man Tony Stark. Weapons dealer, drinks like a fish, and he had never went through the whole tripwire booby trap incident, threatening his life with shrapnel heading to his heart, so he's never lived the experiences that literally changed his life. And when we go back to Blade, who's trying to hunt down the different Avengers, he doesn't even see Wakanda on the map, because in this world it was dismissed as a myth like years ago. The Spirit of Vengeance, the Star Brand, they're considered too dangerous and sent to the negative zone. Danny Rand never became Iron Fist, and it's believed that Captain America had died in World War II, with there being no history or record of him being found in the ice. And with seeing that, like Blade realizes that a majority of these changes, they had stemmed from Captain America never coming back, because in a world where Captain America never comes back and the Avengers aren't formed, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, they never turn into heroes. But then on top of that, with the Squadron Supreme being designed and formed by Coulson to be more lethal, and in this reality, the Squadron kills Quicksilver and Wanda absorbs his speed through her chaos magic, which then makes Wanda the super speed sorcerer, the Silver Witch. And for the Squadron Supreme, you have Blur, who pretty much looks like he's gonna take Marvel from this into a Flashpoint event. Like it was me the whole time, Barry. But after this, we then go to Zarda Shelton, who effectively is like the Squadron Supreme of America's Wonder Woman, and instead of Themyscira, she's from Utopia Isle. But out of all the changes from this team, I think I like hers the most, and mainly because her sworn enemy is Mangog, who's now become the unstoppable Allgog, which likely means that Jane Foster had never became Thor, and Mangog at some point had successfully destroyed Asgard, to where after that he had become the final Allfather. And I mean, like, as far as his backstory, I'm just guessing. But as far as like where this could go between just Zarda and Allgog, in the history of what happened to Asgard, Odin, and Thor in this world, like I would read that story in a heartbeat, especially if it's written by Jason Aaron. But after this, when we go to Dr. Spectrum, who's flown up to the moon to get a better view, and he's immediately attacked by Thanos, who in this case has the Infinity Rings instead of stones, which in this reality don't appear to be as much of a threat, like the rings just do the car dealership thing. But after this, following Blade, he then finds Thor, and Blade lets him know that he remembers Thor telling him about his history of Odin sending him to Earth and pretty much the identity of Donald Blake, but Thor doesn't remember any of that happening. He doesn't know anything about the Avengers, and he doesn't even remember Mjolnir. But while Blade is talking to him and Thor's getting worked up, lightning starts crackling outside, and Blade tries to tell him like, you know that's you, right? And he tries to get him to sober up and like remember, but instead Thor just goes off, he tells him to get lost, and he just throws up on the floor. But from there, Blade doesn't try to persuade Thor any further, like he just walks away and leaves him be. But it's from here where Blade's journey, it catches up with what we had seen earlier with the Black Skull at the nation's capital, which before had jumped from like Blade and Robbie Reyes to days later when all these different villains escaped the negative zone. But in the time between with Blade traveling around and figuring things out, like this is what brought him back, because when he comes here looking for Nighthawk, who's supposed to be like your smartest man in the world, world's greatest detective, like Blade comes here to find out like if he knows the truth like Blade knows the truth. And when he gets there, Nighthawk tells him like, I know you, you're Blade, you're this 2-bit cutthroat, you need to go back to London. Which then has Blade kind of like, well, okay, well then you do know me. But then when Nighthawk asks Blade, like, if you pretty much come here to try your luck. And while they're fighting these dudes off, Blade just takes one of these dudes' heads and he tells Nighthawk, like, look buddy, there is no world, like, there's nowhere where you can lay a hand on me and not lose it. Which like, man, he probably hurt the man's feelings. But Nighthawk declines the 1v1, telling Blade that he has other things to do, like save the world. And Blade tells him like he's trying to do the same thing. And really Blade was just trying to find one other person that he could look in the eye and just confirm that he's not crazy and just know that this whole world is just one big lie. And with talking to Nighthawk here, he pretty much got that confirmation. And when Nighthawk takes his eyes off of him, Blade disappears and he goes on to make his next move. But the twisted thing is like throughout this time with Nighthawk being sent here to save Congress or save the members of Congress, like he's being instructed by the president to do it in a specific order to benefit his political agenda. And it's here where we find out that Philip Coulson, who had originally put this team together, that this universe revolves around this team and Philip Coulson is now the president. And we had seen like how this had all pretty much stemmed from Mephisto and how he began to orchestrate this through War of Realms. And we also talked about Mephisto in King of Black when he had taken back his throne as the King of Hell within the Ghost Rider King in Black tie-in. But as far as how Mephisto got it to get this crazy with the entire universe revolving around the Squadron Supreme of America, like I'm still scratching my head on that one. But with continuing to follow Blade, who while he was in DC, he had broken into the Pentagon and he retrieved the last known coordinates of where Captain America disappeared, which of course was a very broad area, but from there he just used his vampire nose to kind of sniff him out. But also at the same time that this is happening, drunk Thor over in Norway, he then slams his drinking horn on the table and it turns into Mjolnir at the same time that Blade finds Captain America. Alright, so with jumping into the second issue of Heroes Reborn, we immediately jump into the initial arrival of Galactus on Earth. And when this starts off, we get this narration from Hyperion, who's more or less thinking to himself about his new origin, which we had seen before was an origin that was manufactured by Phil Coulson. But with Hyperion thinking back on his origin, with him landing on Earth on a ship many years ago, which is pretty much the origin of Superman, but with thinking back on his origin, he doesn't remember all the details. But he considers things like seeing the ship proof that it happened, and also proof that whoever his parents were, that they loved him dearly. But also as part of his origin, one of the parts that he does remember is that a cosmic mass murderer has consumed his home world, so when Galactus and the Silver Surfer arrive here, Hyperion thinks of his parents, and he hopes that wherever they are, that they're watching him and they're proud of who he's become. But as soon as the Surfer and Galactus arrive, the Surfer tells Galactus that something is heading in at a speed faster than his own, and Hyperion just flies through the head of Galactus, taking him out, one shot, just like that. And when this happens, like, I feel like I gotta say it again, cause like, do not take Heroes Reborn and take this to like y'all's verses, because your nerfed Galactus versus your buffed Hyperion, like this is just something that we're seeing for the sake of the story. Like, don't get mad, it's just entertainment. Because I know it's a few people I've seen the comments of videos like this one, to where you're like, man, I'm just tired of seeing Galactus being used as either a punching bag or just something to show how powerful someone else is. But I just want to let you know, it's been like that as long as I can remember, even going back to 1984 Secret Wars issue 1, when Galactus charged at the Beyonder and he got slapped to sleep. And there's been dozens of times after where Galactus has gotten similar treatment, but don't feel bad because there's plenty others catching smoke from Hyperion in this issue. But after this, we then jump forward to present day, to where we see for Hyperion, his alternate identity, Mark Milton, is a school teacher. And it's very consistent with what we'd seen from Jason Aaron's Avengers issue 18. Back when we first saw the Squadron Supreme turn into Marvel's Justice League. And looking back, I feel like at the time when Jason Aaron had just dropped this in there, and if I remember correctly, it was only for like 2 or 3 issues. But I feel like when he did this, he was just thinking in his mind like, the next thing that Marvel gives me, I'm going hard. Like, I'm pushing these guys to the top of the totem pole. Rubs hands like Birdman. But when we jump back in with the school teacher, Mark Milton, and he's grading one of his students' papers, which is supposed to be a response on the greatest mystery of World War II, and this kid's response in the paper is what happened to Captain America. And Hyperion just gives the girl a C+, telling her she needs to separate what's real from what's myth. And with seeing that, I can't wait to see little Margaret's response once the world finds out that Blade found Captain America. Like, I imagine she's gonna go back to Mr. Milton and be like, hey, Just pass me for the whole semester, I'm done. But then it's also here where we see a few of Hyperion's thoughts kind of wander off again, and when he does, he's considering Zarda's suggestion for the Squadron Supremes to pretty much have their own watchtower, or version of the watchtower, and it seems like it'll be made possible by the way of Zarda's technology from her island, Utopia Isle, which is practically Themyscira. But while Hyperion's here, he gets a call from Reed Richards on a supersonic emergency frequency, and when Hyperion responds, he meets Dr. Richards at SHIELD Labs, and when he gets there, like, Reed Richards is just Reed Richards. There's no Fantastic Four, and Dr. Richards is just a smart guy that works for SHIELD. And when Ben Grimm talks about clobbering time, he talking about watching a fight. But with Reed calling Hyperion here, he lets him know that a number of the villains which they sent to the negative zone, they've escaped, and it's likely that they slipped out when Victor Von Doom was put in. And when Reed expresses the situation, he tells Hyperion how the negative zone is a highly unstable antimatter universe, which I believe he means to the extent of it being difficult to just place anyone there and lock them in without them being able to find a way back, which makes sense with a nihilist skipping his way through every now and then. But with Reed giving Hyperion the update about how a bunch of villains slipped out when Doom got put in, Hyperion now has to go find all of these escaped villains and drag them back to the negative zone. And it's kind of crazy when we see this and we run down the list of these quote-unquote villains, because first when we see Gladiator and the Imperial Guard, not only have they been turned into Brood, but Hyperion also catches them at Cape Canaveral in an attempt to steal a space shuttle and fly back to their throne world. But after stopping them, Hyperion then runs into Mr. Beyonder, who immediately feels like a mixture between the Beyonder and the race of Beyonders all mixed up into one, but then on top of that, kind of shaken together and called like a type of Mixia-Spitalik, especially with Hyperion mentioning that this guy manifests six-dimensional cartoons, which for Mixia-Spitalik which for the other guy over at DC, that's more of a fifth dimension connection. But also with Hyperion catching him, Mr. Beyonder mentions, or he more or less claims, that he had caused the prison break out of boredom, which is almost as nuts as him turning the people in Arkansas into flying sharks. But then after catching him, Hyperion hears a call from Peter Parker, who is effectively Hyperion's Jimmy Olsen, with him being a journalist slash photographer at the Daily Bugle. But also in Peter's case, like, he has no powers, and he's often mentioned to be very clumsy and uncoordinated, and in the words of Hyperion, like, Peter thinks he's his friend. But what's crazy is when Peter calls for Hyperion to stop these bugs, it's actually the bottled hive of Annihilus, which is a huge insult to the actual size of the army of Annihilus. But right after this, Peter, his journalist sense goes off, and he points out to Hyperion that he also has to deal with Ultron. And this Ultron happens to be a mashup of Hank Pym, who at one point was a good Christian, decent husband, which I feel like was another joke from Mephisto or whoever made this world, with that being Hank Pym's background. But at some point, this version of Hank Pym, he got merged with Ultron, who now collectively has a Pym particle heart, and he's able to shift size, while also, according to Peter Parker's assumption, this Ultron was also going to enlarge the Hive of Annihilation, who Hyperion had just froze to death like seconds ago, along with this world's version of General Annihilus. But with facing this version of Ultron, Hyperion takes him out in seconds. And as we run through these, there are a number of others that Hyperion had taken down that we didn't see, like the Winter Soldier along with the Widow Guard, who likely is just this world's version of the Winter Guard, but possibly led by the Winter Soldier and Black Widow. And at this point, he's also taken down the Undersea Terror King, Namor, who from that name alone, I can't imagine that he's too different from the Namor that we already know. But then also Hyperion mentions that he's taken down Mutant Force, which seems to be this world's version of the X-Men. But with mentioning all these guys, he tells Peter Parker that S.H.I.E.L.D's on their way to clean up and collect what's left of Ultron, and then he leaves Peter telling him that he has one more villain left to get. And from there, he just leaves Peter, who's about to get bit by something that's gonna make an interesting headline. But after this, we then go to Hyperion's classroom, and when we get there, the Hulk, he's like trying to talk to the students and see if any of them realize like what's been changed, but with the way that he's talking, like nothing is making sense, because everything's coming out backwards or mixed up, so he can't really get across to the students what he's trying to say. But then not long after we see him here, Hyperion then shows up, and he just knocks the Hulk out of the classroom, asking him like how did he know his secret identity. And when Hyperion says that, it kind of has me thinking, because back when we first saw the Squadron Supreme of America, before Heroes Reborn, during War of Realms, T'Challa met this team, and when he met them, he knew something wasn't right. And it's possible like before this entire world had changed, he may have told a few of the other Avengers. But either way, Banner knew where to look for Hyperion, and that's where Hyperion found him here. But with him going up against the Hulk and effectively making him angrier, That of course then makes the Hulk stronger. And when this happens, like some of the Hulk's sentences start to straighten out, and not all of them, just some of them, because he then starts to tell Hyperion that he knows this world is wrong, Hulk's friends are missing, and he asks where's Earth's mightiest heroes. But with Hyperion starting to struggle, knowing that the Hulk is getting stronger, he's then forced to invoke an executive order, SSA 1939, which I believe was just President Coulson's way of making Hyperion be able to be judge, jury, and executioner in the field. But with him invoking this executive order, he then goes execution style on the Hulk, who in this world is also immortal, so when he zaps him into radioactive goo, he just scoops him up, drops him off in the negative zone, so that next time he's resurrected, it'll be over there. But also with this being the immortal Hulk, and Savage Hulk likely at that. But we also know that in this world, Hyperion has likely already killed him, but the Hulk has been sent to the negative zone before, and it's possible that with the Hulk's resurrection, in this alternate world, that somewhere in there that could be the cause in the mix-up of his words, or Mephisto or whoever just added that in to have fun with the big guy. But in the Hulk's last words, Hyperion hears him say, "Where's Steve?" And after this, we go over to Hyperion's class the next day, and they got the wall re-bricked already, which is quick. Wouldn't have been my school, our class would have been outside in the trailer or something. But then it's here where Hyperion is looking at Margaret Carroll's paper again with the mystery of Steve Rogers. But then also on his desk, he has the front page paper from the Bugle that says, "Parker's luck strikes again. Bugle's Peter Parker, temporarily transformed into a giant spider from alien bite, falls and breaks his own legs, all 8. And with more or less looking back and forth at the two, Hyperion tells the students just to read quietly, and after that he goes to do a bit of investigating on his own. And when he's done, he goes into the sun to kind of go over his thoughts, because for some time now he's had the suspicion that this world has been built from lies. But before this, with looking into it, first he went to the Pentagon and he dug up old records, much like we saw Blade do. But with looking into it, he saw that there was an attempt to find Captain America back when he disappeared, but they never did. But after that, Hyperion then looked over the location where Captain America's body was supposed to be, only to find that something was recently removed from the ice. And with doing this, he considers to bring in Nighthawk to help him make sense of it all, which is where he then goes into the sun to clear his head. And when he does this, he comes to his resolve, which for him is Captain America is long dead, and Hyperion is the Super Sentinel of Liberty. And this world is the truth of all truths. But also, if there's even a possibility that this world is a lie, then he'll do everything in his power to keep it the way it is. And it's pretty crazy because it's a conscious decision. And it would be different if he just didn't know at all or didn't have any suspicions of this world not being the way that it's supposed to be. But at this point, he likes how it is, he likes who he is in this world, and I mean, who wouldn't? Because the dude is crazy OP. But he's made up in his mind that he's not gonna let things change without a fight. But after this, we then go back to his class and he's given a lesson on World War II. But while he's giving this lesson, he notices something outside, so he goes to check it out. But before he gets out there, there's like a whoosh, and all he sees is this homeless guy by himself right outside the classroom window. And we know right away, like, that's Steve Rogers. But when Hyperion sees him, he just sees this guy sitting outside of the classroom window looking suspect. So Hyperion asks him, like, "Can I help you with something?" And Steve tells him he was just listening to that history teacher's lesson, seeing if he can pick up a few things that he missed. So then Hyperion's like, do you have any children that attend this school? And he tells Hyperion, like, nope, didn't get the chance to have kids. Guess that was taken from me too. But with Hyperion not knowing who this is, he tells him he's gotta go, and if he's interested in learning more on history, he'll point him out to a community college or something. But also when Hyperion tries to use his atomic vision to scan him, it keeps shorting out, which is interesting. But since Hyperion can't just scan him to figure out who it is, he asks him, like, do I know you? And Steve just tells him nope, he's just the old vet that the world forgot about, who woke up and realized that he had forgot something important. And when Hyperion asks him, like, what that is, Steve just tells him the truth. And when he goes to shake Hyperion's hand, it hurts him, and he actually feels himself getting weaker around this stranger. And it's really interesting because there's definitely something happening under the surface here. But with Hyperion noticing, he tells him, like, look man, you're gonna have to come with me. And just like that, another whoosh comes through. But this time when it happens, we see that it was Blade who was whooshing back and forth. And he whooshes Steve away just before Hyperion could take him. And at this point we find out, like, when Blade initially took Steve out of the ice, he initially came out swinging because he woke up to a vampire hanging over him. But then after talking to Blade, Blade let him know, like, I'm gonna show you the world, and from there you can tell me if you think that any of this seems right. And Steve lets him know, like, nothing seems right, like even the world that he missed after he'd been under the ice. So he knows that whatever this is, it needs to be fixed. And even though Blade tells him, like, he wants to sit Cap down and explain everything, but then Steve is like, no, show me, because from here they got work to do. Alright, so for Heroes Reborn number 3, this time around it's very much a story about the Blur. Which means like just get ready for all the speedster references you can think of. And even when we jump in as soon as the first page, because when we pick up with the Blur Stanley Stewart, he's sitting at home watching from his 48 different televisions, and on one of these TVs it very much looks like Mephisto cooking, which is almost like a missed opportunity to call it Hell's Kitchen. But I also believe cooking with Mephisto would be nice too. But while he's here, Stanley Stewart runs us through like the life and times of how it is to be a speedster. And from how he describes it, it's like a gift and a curse, because he describes it like sometimes he'll laugh so hard he'll vibrate through his chair, which is interesting, the whole vibrating through objects thing. Like, I think I've seen that somewhere before. But his shoe closet is bigger than a house, and he can't play games online because no Wi-Fi can keep up with him. He has 5 dates in 3 different countries, and he takes 500 selfies in a day, which kind of tells us a bit early on that he's a bit of a narcissist. But after this, we then get the introduction, or like the opening credits to the Blur, who is the fastest mortal alive. But also in the beginning, we get a brief description of his origin, which tells that he went through a strange mist, which magically altered his body chemistry. And during his time while he's not saving the world, Stanley Stewart, he's a mail carrier, window washer, dog walker, barista, and computer programmer, to where sometimes he does all of them in the same day, but most of the time you can find him saving the world as the Blur. But also after this intro, we then get an example of some of the Blur's duties, like as a hero, and from there it takes us into the story. But first we see Stanley Stewart coming from a secret Hyperion lair, where at one point he went up against Ursa Major, who rather than being on the Winter Guard or part of Agents of Wakanda, Ursa Major's just a straight up villain. But this fight also put him through an attack by a number of artificially evolved man-eating minions who he had to get through that were sent by Ursa. But eventually all of this brings us back to Washington DC, to where at this point he's going up against this world's version of the Scarlet Witch, who's known as the Silver Witch, who, like we've seen in the first issue, after the death of her brother Quicksilver, she absorbed his powers, which is how she's now able to throw a number of high-speed hexes at the Blur, sending them 1,000 spells a minute. And with her doing this, she's also claimed the name Speedster Supreme, but according to Stanley, he has a litigation pending on that name. But while this match is going on, Stanley is live streaming it because for one, he doesn't take the Silver Witch that serious. And with the way that this comes off, it's likely because Stanley was already faster than her brother before he died. Because throughout this matchup, we get a bit of that story, with Stanley mentioning that Quicksilver burned himself out trying to keep up with him. But with Stanley not taking this version of Wanda seriously, it catches up to him quick, and no pun intended. But with Stanley being a bit cocky, knowing that he's faster than Wanda, she then hits him with the get over here hex, and she snatches like a portion of his soul. So it's kind of like a bit of Scorpion and Shang Tsung 2 for 1. And initially when I saw this, I thought she was pulling like his astral form like completely out of his body. But with her taking just a portion of his soul, she did this very intentionally. And we find this out when she goes back and she stands over him and she tells him that she wants him to wake up because he doesn't deserve the luxury of fading away in his sleep, but instead she wants him to die like her brother did, on his feet, screaming. And this is why she only took a portion of his soul, because from there she just takes off with it and she drags it into the Dread Dimension, which I'm pretty sure is still the Dark Dimension, which also has been referred to as the Dread Dimension. And I'm pretty much leaning towards that because this place is also littered with mindless ones. But with the Silver Witch snatching a piece of his soul and taking off with it and going here like she's playing a game of keep away, and Stanley has to go after her in order to quote unquote literally save his own soul, or a portion of it at least. But with going after her and trying to figure out like how he's gonna one up her, he then thinks about a number of his other previous adventures at both times in the future and the past of this reality, because at this point he's having trouble keeping up with her. But with him thinking through these different scenarios and kind of fishing for a new idea for this situation, like it's here where he then gives us the narration and just takes us through like one time where he raced from one end of the multiverse to the other, to where when he did, he went up against Death and he faced her in her ring-powered Infinity Chopper, which sounds a lot like a reference to the Thanos or the version of Thanos from this reality, with all of the Infinity Ring stuff going on, which we're likely to see more of in issue 4. But then he also talks about a previous run-in with the Ultron that we'd seen, who had used his pin particles to shrink down and go into Hyperion's lower intestines, and also another time where he ran into the future and he faced off with this world's version of Doom 2099. But it's also interesting when he mentions Doom 2099 and he says that Doom was messing with American history, and when he said that, it kind of had me thinking like, this is the second time recently we've gotten a Doom 2099 reference. And it could mean something, might mean nothing, but I just found it intriguing. But for Stanley Stewart, after thinking of his past escapades and experiences, to where collectively he starts to come up with the solution. And it's here where he runs faster than light and vibrates out of sync with himself, racing through his timeline. And when he does this, he revisits the Johnny Blaze of this world, who is a speedster and also Ghost Rider, known as the Ghost Runner, the speedster of vengeance. And with seeing this, I gotta admit, like, I'm intrigued. Like, I'd really like to see how that whole thing went down, like at least in the one shot or something. But I mean, like, with seeing this, we do know how it actually ended, with Stanley going back through this moment and mentioning that Johnny Blaze's leg bones melted, trying to keep up with him the first time. But I'd still like to see that story just to see how the events played out before. But with Stanley making this shortcut through his timeline, he then takes a power nap in the 33rd century. And when he says power nap, he mentions it was like a few years. But then when he comes back, he skips way closer to the Silver Witch. But even just before he arrived, Wanda had pretty much figured that he was done, because before he got there, she didn't see him behind her, and up to this point, she could feel his soul power fading. And when she did, she figured, like, after she killed the Blur, that maybe this world wouldn't feel wrong anymore, which more or less points to her realizing that this world isn't how it's supposed to be. And even when he gets there, she tells him, like, your soul shouldn't be so easy to snatch from your body. And that's likely a reference to not only this world being false in many ways, but then it's also likely a reference to your alternate version of Stanley Stewart from Earth 712, to where when that world was about to end and there was only a portal that could take one person at a time from their Earth to a safer one, so the Squadron Supreme fought amongst themselves and pretty much killed each other, because otherwise, with them going through one at a time and the portal needing to recharge, they all wouldn't have made it. And in that case, only Zarda made it through, leaving everyone else dead. So it kind of feels like that's what Wanda's referring to, even though she doesn't know, like, the specifics of why this world is wrong or how exactly Stanley's other death had went down. But when this Stanley catches up to her, she just says no more speed. And right after that, he describes the feeling as being stuck in melted adamantium. And it's like, man, the references are just flying left and right out of here. House of M, Death of Wolverine, Flash, everything. Like, this issue's going crazy. But right after Wanda says no more speed, she then just walks off slowly, because it's like there's no point in running. And she tells the Blur to die slow, which is so messed up. But when this happens, like, Stanley truly believes that this is the end. Like, this is how she's gonna kill him. And when we see this, it's like it's here where we immediately go into this flashback with Stanley not long after he became a speedster, which interestingly enough takes us to Tibet, to the mystical monastery of Kamar-Taj, where Stanley went to see the Ancient One in order to study the mystic arts and get his speed under control. And with seeing this, we find out that it was the vigilante that granted him the speed of the wind, but with him initially having this power, he just couldn't control it. And the Ancient One let him know that the answer that he seeks is within the mystic arts. So Stanley then read every book that he could in Kamar-Taj, and even still he didn't know what to do. But with thinking back on this, he remembers the Ancient One telling him to just sit and look at this flower. And it's here where it gets crazy. Like, this is where you cue the Flash music, like the because when he thinks back on the moment of the exercise of staring at that flower, which was an exercise that took him 17 days to figure out. Like, the Ancient One told him, he's like, man, you slow, it's gonna take a while. But what Stanley discovered while staring at this flower was that rather than running or going super fast, he could just sit still and see all of time in one given place at one moment. And when he discovered this, like, this eye opened up in his forehead, which was very Agamotto-like, but in this case, with him using the mystical arts along with his speed, not only could he see throughout time in a given space, but he could also interact with it. And it's a pretty cool concept, because whatever passes through this particular space at any point in time, he could just reach out and snatch it and use it at his disposal. And that's the idea that he comes to, since at this point he can't physically chase and catch Wanda. And when he does this, he hops on a wraith whale and he uses it to get the drop on Wanda while she's watching his soul just like fade into nothing. But this is how he gets his soul back, stops Wanda, and he then rides the whale back to their dimension. But also he admits with doing this that he noticed cracks in this reality, or more so saying that there was cracks in everything, seeing the way that this reality was built. And with taking Wanda back, he just drops her off at Ravencroft, though she's not technically insane, but I guess this is like Marvel's version of Arkham now. or at least in this version of Heroes Reborn. But also, like, in a way, I feel like it kind of works. But also when we see Wanda go in, she's saying like, I'm not crazy, like I'm not insane, this world and everything outside, like that's the madhouse. Which clearly gives us a bit of foreshadowing for what's to come. But as far as the Blur, his speed comes back after Wanda's hex wears off, and right after that, he's then chased by the speedster, Eternity. I'm like, this is so crazy, but I'm intrigued. I am very intrigued. But then after this, we then go back to another part of Ravencroft as we go into like the epilogue portion of the story, to where it seems like Bullseye's about to kill this guy with the tooth. But then check this out, like as soon as this happens, a rat then crawls in the room, or the showers or whatever, and when it crawls on Bullseye, like he's okay until the rat catches on fire. Because I guess he's okay with rats walking up to him and crawling on him, but if it catches on fire, ooh, no, that's a problem. But with this happening, we quickly find out that it was sent by Maya Lopez, who's the most recent host of the Phoenix Force, just before the whole world had went to this. But also at this time we find out that in this new world she's also at Ravencroft, and she's here of her own will. Because I mean, she has the Phoenix Force, what are they gonna do? Put handcuffs on her? Because you probably just burn the whole planet and leave the handcuffs floating in space as a message. But while we see her here just on the roof of Ravencroft, on one hand she's keeping an eye on some of the things going on inside, like the arrival of Wanda Maximoff and Bullseye throwing teeth at people. But also on the other hand, she doesn't know if she's any better than the other people that are in there. Because though she knows this world isn't right, she can't exactly remember if she destroyed the last one, or what exactly happened to make the world the way that it is. Because at this point, she's still figuring out the Phoenix Force and what it can do, and if anything, the one thing that she's certain of is that the Phoenix hungers, like how a fire hungers for a barrel of gasoline. But at this point, she doesn't want to be an echo of who she previously was, which in itself is kind of a play on words, but she very much means it in a literal sense. But then while she's here, she's then approached by Blade and Captain America, who then approach her soliciting her help because Blade had told Cap she has a Phoenix Force and it can destroy worlds, which is precisely what they want to do to this one and find a way to bring back the old one. Because the two of them knew, like before approaching Maya, that some sharp teeth in a frisbee just wasn't gonna cut it. But when this happens and Cap literally tells her like we're putting together a team, in her mind she's already saying yes. Because for one, she knows this world isn't right, but then also she has a Phoenix Force, and the Phoenix Force is just always ready to consume a world. Alright, so as far as this new version of the Marvel Universe that we're dealing with here, I've talked about some of what's been the build up to this point with how we initially got the Squadron Supreme of America prior to Heroes Reborn, and how much of these stories have reflected that, and I put most of that in the first video. But in issue 4, we finally get the reveal that it was blank all along. But we'll get to that in a little bit, just in case somebody accidentally stumbled across this video and they just wanted to be surprised. But kicking things off for this one, we start off at the blue area of the moon, to where at this point you have a number of groups that have come together, like your Skrulls and Kree Empire, and come to think of it, it just looks like Empire never happened here. Lucky for them. But here on the blue area of the moon, where there's also no mention of Inhumans, because they've been out of the picture for a while, but it's here where over a dozen representatives from across different galaxies, they've all come together to hire the greatest bounty hunter across the cosmos, and it's Rocket Raccoon. But in this universe, Groot is a gun, and though I don't think that's been the case like all along throughout this reality, like at some point Groot was turned into a gun, but here and now he's a tree gun. Him and Rocket are bounty hunters, and they're the best at what they do. And I know like it sounds pretty weak like just saying it, but in a little bit we're going to talk about some of the things that Groot can do, and it's pretty insane. But when they arrive here at this meeting, all we really know at this point is that the person that they're hunting is from Earth, and Rocket, he's ready to bag this dude and come back and get the money. But with saying this, Groot, he wants to know more about this bounty and why so many people across the galaxy want him. Because the stories they've heard prior to now, they just can't all be true. But it's after this when we then jump over to the Watcher, who had just left this meeting. And it's here where we follow him to where we find out who this bounty actually is. Because when the Watcher left, he already knew all the stories which the different groups were telling Rocket, because at one point he had just stood by and watched many of these things happen. But then at one point he stepped in, though it went against his sworn duty, just to only watch, and that's when Dr. Spectrum took both of his eyes, because Dr. Spectrum is the great threat that needs to be stopped, and he is the bounty that Rocket and Groot are being sent to kill. And though we don't get like all the examples of what Dr. Spectrum has done, we do get a few examples like him taking the Watcher's eyes and a couple more. But even without it going into depth like from galaxy to galaxy and showing us every little thing that Dr. Spectrum did, but like very early on we kind of get the message. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But with us jumping over to Dr. Spectrum here, Colonel Joseph Ledger, it's here where we see his entire battle with Thanos take place on one page. And at first when I saw this, I was like, come on man, really? But then I thought about it and I'm thinking like, okay, this kind of falls in line with like all the Hyperion battles that we'd seen up to this point, to where as soon as they start, they're finished. And the only time we see a fight or confrontation actually stretched out, it's with someone who's either an Avenger or someone who's supposed to be a hero in the main Marvel universe. But in the case of Thanos getting the Infinity Rings, this wasn't his first time getting them. And so this time Dr. Spectrum confronted him and he just blasted his fingers off. The end. But then after doing this, Dr. Spectrum then took Thanos to nowhere, which in this reality is just a huge prison, which was created by Dr. Spectrum after ripping the head off a Celestial. And man, I know if Noel were alive, like if Noel was alive and he had seen this, he'd have been heated, because Noel is the soldier boy of decapitating Celestials. But with Dr. Spectrum doing this, like here's what I'm talking about. Because he tore the head off the Celestial, turned it into a black site prison, and he did this just to show as an example that there's only one God out there and he's American. Which are two things I want you guys to pay attention to, because those are the things that the Squadron Supreme of America put emphasis on the most, which are their God and their country. And as we see this unfold, and more so with Dr. Spectrum, with the choices made of taking the Watcher's eyes and building this black site prison, which is cosmic powered because it is the head of a Celestial. And that's also another takeaway from Noel, much like we talked about after we covered like what happened to the Sentry after he died, because in that same video we talked about how the Necro Sword got its power and also lost its power. But here's the thing about Dr. Spectrum and what he's doing across the different galaxies, with him using extreme force and doing who knows what to all these different empires, as well as him also throwing some in the negative zone. But all of these moves that he's making throughout the universe, he's imposing the will of his God in his country. But for Dr. Spectrum, as soon as he drops off Thanos and leaves nowhere, he's then immediately attacked by Rocket and Groot, who are likely just on a stakeout like right outside of nowhere, just waiting for Dr. Spectrum to either be going in or coming out. But whatever they did, it worked and they caught him on his way out. But for Dr. Spectrum, meeting Rocket Raccoon for the first time, like he's heard of his reputation as the deadliest bounty hunter in the galaxy. And from just looking at Rocket, like he finds it hard to believe. But then when he brings out Groot, the tree gun, which once again doesn't sound like much, but when Groot lets off and all these little mini I am Groots just start latching to Dr. Spectrum, he immediately gets humbled like real quick, because when these I am Groot bullets start latching on to Dr. Spectrum, they start to grow on him and cover his whole body. And when this happens, it looks crazy painful. And Dr. Spectrum is trying to ask his prism like, how does he fight these things? How does he stop them? But this whole process has him separated from his prism, which is also the source of his power. And he tries to tear his way out of these vines to get back to it, but Rocket then just hits him with a maggot gun. Because by the request from everyone from the blue side of the moon, who are gonna pay Rocket for bringing this guy back in pieces, like part of their request for this bounty was that he makes sure that Dr. Spectrum suffers. So that's kind of what we got going on here. But of course, with this Rocket Raccoon being Rocket Raccoon, he sees the prism as something he can take and pawn to Old Man Quill, who I would like to just see in this reality. But before Rocket can snatch the prism, it returns back to Joseph Ledger and it restores back to him his power. When this happens, like Joseph admits that he doesn't know how this prism works exactly, and he also expresses that this prism was a gift from quote unquote God Almighty, so that he could be an instrument among the Forsaken Stars. But as soon as he gets the prism back, Groot is trying to charge at him and he just turns around and blasts Groot. And when he does this, Dr. Spectrum tells Rocket and what's left of Groot that he himself is the reason that there's no more Kree accusers, there's no more Black Novas or Starjammer space pirates, because he's the reason that someday space will be safe for decent God-fearing American settlers, which very much sounds like it lines up with his God and his country. But at this point, with Rocket pretty much figuring that he's lost this fight, he orders for his ship to fire all the antimatter mines and negabombs on his location. And after firing on his location, he wants the ship to get out of there as fast as possible, at double light speed to protect the passenger who's on it. And as soon as he does this, his hands start glowing, and right away he's like, what is she doing? Because he didn't want the girl on his ship to send him her power, but she does it anyway, and all of a sudden Rocket Raccoon is Starbrand. And from that alone, it kind of tells you who's on the ship, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit, along with some flashback stuff as well. But for Rocket Raccoon, when he gets the Star Brand, he immediately flips back into fight mode, taking the heat directly back to Dr. Spectrum. But then also it's here where we get a bit of flashback for Dr. Spectrum to where at one point he was interrogating Ego the Living Planet, because prior to this Dr. Spectrum had found carbon trails from secret space flights that were leaving Earth, and Dr. Spectrum took offense because they weren't American. But because of that, he pressed Ego to find out where these ships had came from, and for Ego, who has eyes the size of moons, he told Dr. Spectrum that they came from Wakanda. But with hearing this, he didn't believe Ego, because in this reality, Wakanda is still a secret, and for that reason, Dr. Spectrum had believed that Ego had been lying the whole time. But then jump back to now, when he sees Rocket with the Star Brand, he immediately knows that the Star Brand shouldn't be here in this reality, because he had already confronted someone else who was from some other new reality, and with confronting them, Dr. Spectrum had already thrown them and the Star Brand in the negative zone, so for that reason it shouldn't be here. But with this matchup that pretty much turns into Battle of the Constructs, and on one hand you have Dr. Spectrum, who then puts together a whole row of tanks and just blasts them at Rocket, while on the other hand you have Rocket, who not only was best friends with the gun, but he's a pretty dang good engineer at that. And so in return, he builds a bigger gun that shoots stars. And when this happens, Rocket is just like, okay, you're done. And Dr. Spectrum on the other hand, he's like, you know what? God help me, I'm starting to like this guy. But when he shoots this star at Dr. Spectrum, he just cuts it in half, and it's nuts. This dude even fighting the Star Brand, it's beyond me. But that's not even the kicker, because he then tells Rocket that he's been places and seen things that Rocket couldn't even imagine. And when saying this, he tells Rocket that he has absorbed the Cancerverse into his prism. And with saying this, he means the actual Cancerverse, like Earth 10011, and not like an alternate version, but the actual thing, with the many angled ones and the eternal living version of death. And he just releases a portion of this necro system on Rocket, who is instantly just consumed by its corruption. But even still, Dr. Spectrum just doesn't stop there. And he tells Rocket, since you like stars so much, I got just the thing for you. And then he takes Rocket and smashes him headfirst into a supernova. And when he does this, it effectively kills Rocket. But as Rocket dies, Dr. Spectrum, he expected Rocket to give out a little sooner, but before Rocket went out, he used every use of colorful profanity, to where some of which Dr. Spectrum hadn't even heard in any quadrant. And yep, that sounds like Rocket. But then after this, we then go right back to his ship, and it's here where we see the girl who he was talking about, who is none other than Brandy Selby, the Star Brand baby. And upon Rocket's death, the Star Brand returned back to her. But then also it's here where we hear the ship initiate protocols that are kicking in right after Rocket's death, and it's here where we hear his message for Brandy, which are for her to stay safe and stay hidden until one day where she'll save the whole galaxy, and when that day comes, she'll know. But then after this, we go back to Earth in Washington, D.C., to where we see this conversation between Dr. Spectrum, Joseph Ledger, and President Phil Coulson. And at this point, Colonel Ledger, he's filling in President Coulson, letting him know that the Star Brand got away, but also that he figured out that the Watcher and the other intergalactic representatives had placed a bounty on him, and he lets the President know that he's going to take care of them soon. And when he tells him this, President Coulson looks at him and is like, hey, you look like you have more that you want to say. Just know that we're in the house of the Lord, you can speak freely here. And it's here where Colonel Ledger tells him that he had a recent meeting with the Squadron Supreme of America, and in that meeting, the Blur had mentioned what he'd seen in the Dread Dimension, which much like we'd seen in issue 3, the Blur noticed that the fabric of reality had been tampered with. But Colonel Ledger tells President Coulson that he just figured all that was nonsense, because as Dr. Spectrum, he's seen the entire cosmic tapestry. So if anything had been tampered with, then he would know. And as soon as he says this, the offering plate goes by, and we see a $10 bill that says, "In Mephisto, we trust." And it shows us right away that when it comes to God and country for the Squadron Supreme of America, that Mephisto is their god. And it really isn't so much of a reveal at this point, but it's still nice to see it confirmed. Though there are still many questions of how exactly Mephisto pulled this off. And that explanation back in the main universe, it probably started when he reclaimed his throne as the King of Hell within Ghost Rider King in Black, but even still, there are many questions yet to be answered about how this whole thing with Phil Coulson and the Squadron Supreme of America went from semi-local to the entire Marvel Universe. But then after this, going into the epilogue, it's here where we have the flashback for your history of Brandy Selby and how many years ago she had came across Rocket and Groot in this universe. Because when they found her, she was just floating in space and Groot snatched her up to take her in, while Rocket was a bit more hesitant because he initially thought this was just the Skrull in disguise that was gonna kill them both as soon as she got on board. But with them taking her in and pretty much raising her, we then fast forward to today after Rocket's death, and it's here where she tells Groot, who's grown back at this point, likely from one of the plants that were still on the ship, but it's here where she just spazzes out, telling Groot that she wants to go back to Earth. And Groot tells her like to stay hidden to stay safe, in pretty much the same speech that Rocket had given, but for Groot of course it only comes out as I am Groot. But at this point Brandy doesn't want to hide anymore, and she tells Groot like that's what Rocket would say, but he's dead now. And at this point she tells Groot that she's old enough to know that something is wrong with the universe and the Star brand can fix it. And with saying this, she demands that Groot takes her to Earth, because if he doesn't, she'll go on her own, and when she gets there she's going for Dr. Spectrum. But as soon as Brandy says this, they're then approached by a ship, to where they're then hailed by Captain Okoye of the Star Panther Wakanda. And when we see this, like, this is clearly the secret ship which Ego was talking about when he was interrogated by Dr. Spectrum. But then also it's pretty interesting, like the Wakanda, I think that was the same name of the ship that we'd seen the Wakandans aboard within the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda. But this time clearly something else is going on, because it looks like the Blackbird from the X-Men animated series intro. But where we start off with this one, it begins at the Ravencroft Asylum, which already has Arkham vibes from the get-go. But when we jump in, we start off with Kraven the Hunter, who's running through Ravencroft Asylum, taking out security, taking out police officers, the Ravencroft staff, like anything that's moving, while wearing like a previous version of Nighthawk's suit. And he's doing this very much as a taunt to lure Nighthawk out, while claiming that wearing this suit and tearing his way through all these people is a way of proving that he's a better version of Nighthawk than the actual Nighthawk. And it's likely him trying to one-up the vigilante by going past the fear factor and straight to murder. But also while we see this, we get a bit of commentary from Nighthawk, who gives us a bit of a brief run through of his backstory, and it's here we find out that his parents, they never wanted him, and it's something that he came to the conclusion of with them constantly pushing him off to different butlers or sending him off to boarding school just to get rid of him. And eventually when his parents were killed, he had later become Nighthawk, to where then he believed that the work he was doing at night, that it would somehow make his parents proud and prove that he was a worthy son who his parents would look to from beyond the grave and see him doing the deeds that would have earned them noticing him. But with him dealing with that constant void in his life with what should have been parental love, and with Nighthawk knowing that the world ain't just gonna hand you that love and fill the void, so then he just settled with fear. And Nighthawk admits that there's plenty of people throughout the halls of this asylum who had really came to that same conclusion. And in a number of their cases, they had some messed up childhood, which may have been worse than his, but even still, he doesn't see himself too different from them. Either way, they're broken, and either way, they're trying to fill that void. But with Kraven tearing through this asylum, Commissioner Luke Cage, who definitely gave himself away with the sweet Christmas comment, but him and his men are then overtaken by clouds of smoke, to where initially Commissioner Cage didn't know what was going on until he found Kraven disarmed and tied up, which let him know that the real Nighthawk was there, which then caused him to pull back his men and create a perimeter around Ravencroft Asylum so that Nighthawk could go in and handle the rest, because there's still a few more dozen super psychopaths who are still on the loose within Ravencroft Asylum. So the commissioner got out of his way, and what was left of the security, they saw the smoke and they heard things get quiet, and they just left a path for Nighthawk to make his way through so that he could get to the others inside. And with Nighthawk heading into Ravencroft Asylum, like as he makes his way in, you also hear this laugh, which right away tells you like, okay, here comes his version of the Joker, along with the similar staging of a Batman Arkham setup. But also as he makes his way in and he sees the handiwork of Kraven and some of the other criminals who have escaped from their cells. But then it's here where we get a look at the process of him actually getting the call and then making his way here. Because during the day, this version of Kyle Richmond, who sits as one of the weakest members in the House, to where in that seat he has no real voting power in Congress. But when we find him earlier addressing the need for mental health care, it was at this time we got the alert during the day, to where he rushed out from that hearing, called in a life model decoy, and it was from there he went down the bat pole. I mean the night pole. Wait, that don't sound right. Or I guess it was the hawk pole? Well, he went down a pole into the night cave, which is located under the Capitol building. But with seeing this in whatever you want to call the pole, like it very much reminded me of the bat pole or the bat poles, which were just behind the bookshelf in the old Adam West show. Like it legit hit a little bit of nostalgia for me, like I like that. But it's here for Kyle Richmond underneath the Capitol building, where he has his version of the bat cave, which is the night cave. And throughout here, much like Batman, he has his relics like the Winter Soldier's arm, Silver Samurai's mask, Elektra's size, Hate-Monger's mask, and man, we haven't talked Hate-Monger since Marauders. But he also has the mask of Baron Zemo, and it legit has like Bruce Wayne interior decorating like all over the place. But from here, we see him take his version of the Batmobile, which in his case is called the Hawk Rod. And man, like Jason Aaron, I gotta take my hat off to you for that one. Like that was a mad clever name choice right there. But also with him making his way to Ravencroft Asylum, like it's also here we find out that he has very much like the same abilities as your 616 Nighthawk, who had taken the formula which would give him super strength or moderate super strength throughout the day. But then when night came around, he would then get like a modest buff in strength, which wasn't off the charts like super crazy, but it would take him from like your regular Captain America strength to like an entry-level Spider-Man. I'm not sure if that helps. But in the nighttime, he would also have enhanced senses, and from what we're seeing from this Nighthawk, his abilities are very similar, but also with it feeling like it has a hint of Moon Knight sprinkled on it in a couple ways. But with us jumping back to this version of Nighthawk and then making his way further into Ravencroft Asylum, the laughter he had heard earlier is getting louder, and as he goes deeper in, like it's here where we run into his rogues gallery, which is the lizard who kind of feels like his version of Killer Croc. But then you also have Bullseye, who we had known to be here in Ravencroft Asylum after seeing him in another incident within Heroes Reborn number 3. But then also you have Moon Knight, Sabretooth, Doc Ock, and even Deadpool, who in the case of Deadpool, I feel like Deadpool was a bit underutilized in this. And in Deadpool's case, like it's really just like a cameo, much like we had seen with Thanos when he fought Dr. Spectrum. And when I see minimal moments like in a story like this, I get it, because there's already so much going on and like we haven't even scratched the surface of this one. But with there already being so much going on, if it digresses too much, then the reader just doesn't know what to cling on to. And trust me, there's plenty going on here. Because also where we have Nighthawk who's fighting his way through to where he's then approached by the Black Skull, who like we'd seen before is your Red Skull with the Venom symbiote. But then it's here where we find out that during the first Secret Wars in this reality, and let me stop you right now, like before any of you guys try to think about this too deeply and try to make logic like, well, if this is an alternate reality and he went to Battle World, why wasn't he in the first Secret Wars? And I'm gonna just say right now, like we don't know if Mephisto planted these memories as he crafted this reality, or if time did pass and all of these events happened over a number of years and their Secret Wars took place within a sandbox. Like we don't know, and I'm sure it'll be cleared up later, but for the time being, I'm just gonna roll with it. But in the case of Nighthawk, during the first Secret Wars, he had brought the symbiote back to this Earth to where he then found out the suit was alive, much like Peter Parker, to where then he had got rid of it. And so now when we see the symbiote with Black Skull, it's trying to go back to Nighthawk, much like we had seen the Venom symbiote try to go back to Peter Parker. But between the symbiote grabbing hold of him and also Otto Octavius jumping in, who by the way in this world had his additional arms taken, so he literally uses an octopus, or matter of fact a number of them, but Nighthawk is able to get out of both with using devices from his utility belt, while also last but not least stopping Deadpool before he went upside his head with a sledgehammer. But it's after this where Nighthawk makes his way to the source of that laugh, and it's the Green Goblin, Mr. G, who is of course his version of the Joker. And when Nighthawk gets here, the Green Goblin is holding Gwen Stacy over the ledge, but also in this world, Gwen Stacy is Nighthawk's most recent sidekick by the name of Night Gwen, even though Nighthawk would prefer her to be called Nightbird so that she doesn't have a hero name with her actual name in it, but she preferred to be called Night Gwen, and that's just what it is. But then also here's the thing, because with the Green Goblin holding Gwen Stacy over the ledge, he lets her go, and like right away, I'm thinking Spider-Man, Death of Gwen Stacy part a million right here. But as it turns out, this had taken Nighthawk to a flashback of the death of his first partner, Falcon, who had actually died in this world the same way that Gwen Stacy had died in the 616. And not like the exact same way, because it's not like he caught Falcon and his neck broke, but rather Nighthawk just didn't get there in time, and his first sidekick Falcon died as a result. So with that being the case, like don't be surprised if we get a story later on called Under the Red Wing or something. And I mean, probably not, but if it happens, you heard it here first. But with the Goblin dropping Gwen, Nightwing, he does catch her in time, but only to find out that she's already been infected. And when she attacks him, he throws Hawkerangs her way, which catch her in the arm, and then she throws the Hawkerangs at the Goblin, which catch him right in the face. And it's here where we get to the very Joker-esque motive of the Green Goblin, because he wanted Nighthawk to either kill him or be involved with his death in order to break him. And with Nighthawk rushing over to him, he knocks out Scarecrow. And I don't care what nobody said, that's Scarecrow. But when Nighthawk makes his way to the Goblin, saying like he's not gonna let him die, the Goblin then pushes the Hawkerangs deeper into his own face. Talk about how about now? But for the Goblin, like as the life is slipping from his body, he tells Nighthawk like, hey, you can kill me, like nobody will know. But Nighthawk still refuses, and he calls for Commissioner Cage to bring in the paramedics. But then also in the Goblin's last words, like his last request, his dying wish, like he tells Nighthawk that he heard from the Silver Witch that this reality isn't what it's supposed to be. And he tells Nighthawk just before he blacks out, don't let them change the world back, because he really likes it this way. But with this happening, like, in my humble opinion, if your arch enemy tells you that this reality isn't right, but don't change it, and even if Nighthawk already knew, but if your greatest foe says don't change it, that likely should be a red flag that lets you know that even if you weren't going to change it, that you probably should. But in the case of Nighthawk, much like we saw with Hyperion, like, he thinks over the idea of this reality not being the truth, and Nighthawk more or less comes to the same conclusion that he doesn't want it to change. But for Nighthawk, his justification process is a bit different, because in his case he thinks of how he's doing so much more than anyone else, and at the end of the day it's what you do that matters more than anything, and this is like his reasoning for not wanting anything in this reality to change. But while he's thinking this over to himself within the Night Cave, he then also checks out the footage from Ravencroft Asylum, to where he then finds Blade, who he recognizes from issue 1, but then when he checks to see if all the inmates have been accounted for, he sees that they all have except for one, Maya Lopez, who had escaped before the riots, but like we had seen before, she had just been hanging around Ravencroft, and is here where Nighthawk sees the footage of her leaving with Blade and another figure who initially Nighthawk can identify until he sees the shield and he's like, wait a minute, is that a Star-Spangled Shield? Which then immediately raises his suspicion. But then right after this, we then go into the epilogue where we find Nighthawk fighting against Ronan, to where right away we get this narration from Ronan about him coming here to Washington as they battle down the Washington Monument. But for Ronan, he comes here in order to seek the truth, but even with doing so, forsaking his family in a sense. But this is what led Ronan to sneak into the headquarters of the Squadron Supreme in order to get these answers, to where then he was confronted by Nighthawk. But after this confrontation, like, Nighthawk, he's super puzzled, because for one, his Hawkerangs, they're made of adamantium, and Ronan was able to deflect them with his sword. And this led Nighthawk to ask him, like, what is that sword made of? Who are you? And why are you sneaking into the Squadron Supreme's headquarters? But Ronan doesn't say anything, he just disappears with his purple energy, teleporting away. But he wanted to tell Nighthawk he broke into the Squadron Supreme headquarters because he knows that's where they keep the secrets of the world. But after Ronan teleports away, he admits that the truth is that the only thing that he really knows is that he doesn't know anything, but someone over there does. But it's here where he teleports to Africa and he disables his cloaking technology, and it's revealed to us that it was T'Challa, the Black Panther. But the thing that had led him to sneak away from his family and seek this mission for the truth, and it's because a few years back, he found an ancient dead celestial buried deep under the ice of the Arctic, which was calling out to him to help it rise. And with T'Challa answering to this call, and then harnessing some of the power from that celestial plus some of his technology, he was then able to create ways to sneak in and out of Wakanda in order to pursue the truth. But it's not long after he gets back and he changes out of his disguise as Ronan and he makes his way to Wakanda, it's here where he finds that he's being followed. And when we see who it is, it's none other than Blade and Steve Rogers. And it's here where he realizes the truth has been looking for him too. Alright, so when we jump in with issue 6, it picks up with the fight that we had seen in issue 1 between Zarda the Power Princess and the unstoppable Allgog, or better yet, the final Allfather, destroyer of Asgard, the unstoppable Allgog, the Eater of Gods, which is a long name slash title slash multiple titles to put together. But to be honest, if Marvel went back and told his story, I would love to see it. Because when we jump into Heroes Reborn number 6 and we see more of him fighting against Zarda, Allgog talks about how he ate Odin and how Odin tasted like beard and soured mead, and the one with pretty horns and black magic who he ate as well, which sounds like Heimdall, but consuming that one in particular gave him the squirts, which is a bit of TMI. But then he also expresses that everyone else on Asgard practically tasted like nothing, which then has him curious for how the utopian princess will taste, which he finds out very quickly in when he nearly consumes her, and he describes her as soft and sweet, just like any other princess. But in the case of Zarda, who's the last of her sisters from Utopia Isle, and we found out the how and why to all of that in the Magneto and the Mutant Force one-shot. But it's here where Zarda tells Allgog that the women of Utopia Isle, like, they were like no other. They could drink any creature under the table, and depending on how drunk they were, they'd either smash that creature with the table or smash them into the table after. But then it's here where she tells Allgog, after being spewed out of his mouth, that she left something behind inside of him, which was one of her gauntlets made of utopian uru, which are bound to her soul with unbreakable astral chains. And as soon as she says this, she yanks that gauntlet that she left in him back, spilling his insides all on the outside. But then following her match with Allgog, like just after she defeats him, it's here where we then follow her back to what's her new home since she left Utopia Isle, which now is the Statue of Liberty, to where the statue and the island she's pretty much turned into her own citadel. But on top of that, it's here we find out that the Utopians not only forged their own Uru metal, or their own version of Uru metal, but also they knew the ancient secret of turning flesh into stone, which is precisely what Zarda had did to Algog after defeating him, to where she then added him to her collection here at the Statue of Liberty. And amongst her collection, there are many others who she's defeated, like Janet Van Dyne and Tigra, who Tigra, by the way, could have been utilized a lot more, especially with the Zarda Power Princess Wonder Woman parody we got going here, because Tigra's like your clearest, closest character to Cheetah in the Marvel Universe, with her first getting a suit that gave her cat-like powers, only to later have her powers permanent when she was bonded to the cat people through an ancient spell. And I feel like we talked about the cat people a while back when we were getting into like the weird history of Morbius and like his journeys throughout the multiverse, but just the idea of Tigress and her history just being mentioned in this Power Princess story, it just has me thinking of how that could have went if Jason Aaron had decided to go deeper into that idea, either in this story or another one-shot. And if it was a one-shot, I'm sure it'd be a different writer, but with the groundwork that Jason Aaron has laid here, like people could dig back into this for years. But also among Zarda's collection, we get the mention of Null, the King in Black, who Zarda had defeated at some point in time, and is mentioned very casually, as if it was light work for her, which we know is mainly because Mephisto had made the Squadron Supreme of America so OP. But in the case of Princess Zarda, like this is also created for her a few issues, because in her case, like with the history that she was given, she was the first of her race of ancient superwomen to permanently leave Utopia Isle. And when she entered the world of men, she was lured with the promise of something that she couldn't get on Utopia Isle, which was the fruits of war. And within this version of Zarda, she constantly hungers for the next war. But this craving and also her relationship with Hyperion, like these are things that we had seen back in Avengers issue 18 when Phil Coulson had originally created these heroes' backgrounds. To where at the time Phil Coulson had also designed these two to more or less be America's power couple, which was also a very New 52 Superman and Wonder Woman type of thing. But in this case, Phil Coulson was like less love, more lust. But in this issue, we also find out that Zarda, she's much like the Zarda we've always known, because at the end of the day, she's gonna do what she wants to do. And much like the other members of the Squadron Supreme of America, there's also this part of Zarda that deviates from the script. And we see some of that as she thinks back on her fling with Namor, and I'm sure Phil Coulson is somewhere like, I can't make this up. But also with Zarda desiring a war or some type of conflict, she then thinks back to the civil war that had taken place within this reality, which is a war that had brewed up between Nighthawk and Hyperion, with Nighthawk having feelings for Princess Zarda and that fueling the conflict. And at this point in time, Zarda just thinks over the idea of stirring something back up by just using that, or perhaps initiating another War of the Realms. But in the middle of Zarda brainstorming like how to start something, she hears a huge crackle of thunder, and when she hears it, she knows that it's not just any regular thunder. Like she recognizes that it's a god's cry. And so to find out what it is, she goes out to her statue garden, she wakes up Hercules, and she binds him with a chain of veracity, demanding that he tells her what he hears or what exactly this thunder means. Because to Zarda's knowledge, Hercules is one of the last gods remaining. But Hercules, he doesn't give up any information, he just laughs hysterically. So then Zarda just turns him back into stone, and she goes from there to investigate what this was on her own. And this leads her to her armory to retrieve an axe that she had forged from the pieces of the broken Rainbow Bridge, which had been shattered with the destruction of Asgard when Mangog became Algog, which is also when the Ragnarok Wars began. But with her taking this axe, which is called the Rainbow Axe, and I think Zarda could have been a little more creative with that part, but hey, it looks good and it's functional. But with her taking the Rainbow Axe and opening the Bifrost, she makes her way back to Asgard, because with her believing this sound to be the cry of a god, or perhaps even a ghost, she investigates Asgard first, with her considering it to be pretty much a graveyard. But it's when she gets here that she also finds a stranger who's wandering around with great hair and terrible clothing. And when she sees him, there's like this object like whirling around him super quick, and at the speed that it's going, it's too fast for her to identify. And when she asks this guy who he is, who we know to be Thor, like she doesn't initially pick it up that it is him, because in this world there had been old myths of the son of Odin. They had said that many years ago that he had disappeared from Asgard, and ever since there was no sign of him. So even with seeing him and knowing of him, she's not aware of who he is. But when Thor sees the axe that Princess Zarda is holding, he immediately recognizes that it's made from pieces of the Bifrost. So by just seeing Zarda with the axe, he sees her as a threat, which then causes Zarda to go at Thor because she had been hoping to find a fight anyway. But when she throws the rainbow axe, it's deflected by this object that's just been whirling around Thor this whole time. But also with her coming for him so aggressively, and not to mention with the rainbow axe, Thor initially believes that she had caused all this destruction on Asgard. But even with Thor zoning her with the lightning as she's coming at him, she still doesn't know who he is, because once again, the most that she's heard is that there was a missing son of Odin, but to her that's only like a forgotten Norse myth. But with her coming for Thor, like right here, I couldn't help but think of death metal, because when she gets close enough, she impales him with her invisible sword, and it very much makes me think of death metal and King in Black actually, like both at the same time here. But while Zarda is fighting with Thor, she tells him like what actually happened to Asgard, with filling him in about the unstoppable Algog and how the Asgardians destroyed each other while Algog only grew stronger and he had just taken them out. But even with her saying this, Thor's not really convinced that she didn't do it, so he then pushes her back with the hurricane breath, which is like your throwback Journey into Mystery Thor kind of deep cut, because it's not really a move that Thor uses that often in recent years, but nonetheless to this day it's still very effective. And with this happening, Zarda's kind of thinking like, okay, who is this guy who calls for lightning, he exhales hurricanes, his blood smells like booze, and he's got some kind of object wisping around that's even too fast for Zarda's super eyes to identify. And with seeing this, Zarda, she figures out that, okay, this guy is clearly a god, but it makes her come at him even harder because she feels a bit threatened, and because of that she hits him hard and she tells him that nobody missed the gods because of me, because in this world she defeated Gore the God Butcher, she ended the Phoenix Saga, she stopped the Hulk when he came back from Sakaar, she fought out the Celestials, and because of her history in this world, she believes that after these hundreds of years that she's earned the right to be who she is and she deserves to be worshipped. And it's right then when Mjolnir goes upside her head and Thor catches it, remembering who he is. And when this happens, he goes back to your classic clean-shaved Jack Kirby Thor, and he tells her, I remember everything. This is Mjolnir, I'm its master, I'm the blood son of Allfather Odin. And he goes on to say that even though the gods are gone from this maddened reality, the mighty Thor was always more than just a god. And he tells her that he remembers everything, and with leaving, he tells her that he remembers the Avengers. But then after this, Princess Zarda, she then goes to meet with the Squadron Supreme, and she tells him about this stranger that she faced off with who calls himself Thor, and she tells the squadron that she punched him so hard that his beard came off. So you can tell right off the bat, this is one of those let you tell it type situations. But with her filling in the Squadron Supreme of America about what had happened, she couldn't get the last words of Thor out of her head, and it's here with meeting with the squadron that she asked them, have any of them ever heard of beings called the Avengers? But then it's after the story to where, for Thor, we then get his perspective from viewing this world for countless centuries. And even though he spent all that time drunk, and surprisingly without alcohol poisoning, like that's the real superpower here, like who you kidding? But with him now looking back with his sober mind, he starts to remember a lot of things, like Zarda's first hunt from a child, slaying Vikings in Iceland, where she had her first kill, and even throughout to World War II, where she fought alongside the US and slayed Hitler. But throughout all this time for Thor, for some reason, this drinking horn, which we had seen in a previous issue turn into Mjolnir, like all these years, his drinking horn would never go dry. Like there was always mead for him to drink, and to keep him drunk and out the way. And what's crazy is that in this world, when Gore the God Butcher set off the God Bomb, Thor felt it. But with the story playing out here, very different than what it did back in Thor God of Thunder, Princess Zarda stopped Gore, stopped the God Bomb, and not with 2 Mjolnirs, but with her bare hands. And trust me, you're not the only one who's seen this and was just like, come on, man. But in this case, Jason Aaron, he can do it to his own story. Like, he gives himself a pass. But as the story goes in this reality, instead of having your 3 different Thors, you had your 3 versions of Zarda who had taken the Necro Sword, turned it into the Necro Lasso. But with Thor seeing this, he remembers how it truly happened, and he recognizes that this was supposed to be the different versions of him across the timeline, because the battle with Gore, that was his fight. But also, that's one of the things with Zarda, like in this world, your Princess Zarda, because for her, over these hundreds of years, she believes that she's fought and earned who she is to this day. But the truth is, she's been living in cheat mode her whole life. And with coming to this realization, Thor is pissed, and thunder and lightning are just crack-a-lacking everywhere. And with this happening, it gets the attention of Maya Lopez, the new Phoenix, and she approaches Thor like, let me guess, the world's not exactly the way you remember it. And it's here where she tells Thor that her and her friends can help. But then also with seeing this, like, I can't help but think like when Thor joins Blade and Maya and T'Challa and Cap, and I could just imagine there being a moment where Blade is like, oh, when I asked you, you couldn't come, but when Maya come through, and all of a sudden you like Avengers Assemble, or just something petty like that. But I get it, we know Thor was drunk then, he was kind of losing it in Norway, but he's back now, so we know that everything's all good. And who knows, there could also be like a underlining Phoenix family thing going on, like who knows. Alright, so as soon as we jump back into Heroes Reborn with number 7, we're given a flashback to the Civil War of this universe that we had seen Zarda make references to back in Heroes Reborn issue 6. Because even though this battle on the surface was about the Hero Registration Act, the true root of this conflict had to do with Nighthawk and his feelings for Zarda, which at the time Nighthawk, he had really just expressed it like he didn't want to comply with the alien, and that alien being Hyperion, who wasn't from this world, which quickly turned this whole thing into a Batman versus Superman like story, especially with Hyperion saying you're gonna die bitter and broken just like your parents. And I mean, Superman wouldn't have said that, like he wouldn't have hit that low, but I think you kind of get the picture. Because for Nighthawk, like the same way that we saw Batman armor up to go against Superman and more or less use all the advantages that he could, in this case, Nighthawk, he gets back the symbiote, as well as using the Eye of Agamotto to even the playing field as much as he can against Hyperion. But like with seeing them battle and crash through buildings like a Zack Snyder film, as well as a Daily Bugle billboard, which kind of makes it seem like in this world, J. Jonah Jameson has it out for Nighthawk since there is no Spider-Man here. But with seeing this and having Jason Aaron like go so far to even have the line of Hyperion saying that in a civil war, both sides bleed. Like too much fun was being had making this comic, like. But one of the last things we see into this flashback is Hyperion taking Nighthawk into space in order to fly his symbiote into the sun, which as we know didn't destroy the symbiote because the Red Skull has it now, but from what it seems that was at least enough to end the conflict. But after that, when we jump forward to today, there's still a bit of that tension there like Zarda had mentioned, but at this point when we get back into the meeting which she's called for the Squadron Supreme of America to ask them what they know about these beings called the Avengers after her recent encounter with Thor, and it's here where we start to get everyone's take on as far as what they know about the Avengers, which at first isn't much because Dr. Spectrum, he's flown to every corner of the cosmos and he's never heard of them, and neither has the Blur, but then in the blink of an eye, like just to be sure, he then runs over to prison and punches on Frank Castle a few times to try to get a few answers, like just to be sure, but he comes back with nothing. And with hearing this, like I'm sure that Frank even knows that that just wasn't right. But then it's here where we hear from Hyperion, who opens up and he expresses about his feelings of things not being right. And after talking to his psychiatrist, Doc Samson, Hyperion has decided to open up to the others and tell them more about his most recent encounter with the Hulk, which at the time had sent Hyperion searching into the Arctic in order to find Captain America, but of course at the time he turned up with nothing. But with hearing this, it also shows us that prior to Zarda calling this meeting, like Hyperion, he was likely going to keep all this to himself. And in Heroes Reborn #2, Hyperion did mention that he considered talking to Nighthawk, but instead of going to Nighthawk, Hyperion had just went up to the sun, to where at the time he then came up with his own reasoning that if things are different, then he doesn't want them to change. But at this point, after him speaking to Doc Samson and having this meeting with Zarda and the others, we now see a part of Hyperion who's acknowledging that something isn't right and something's wrong with this world, and it's like right in front of their face. And even with Hyperion saying this, I wouldn't say that he necessarily wants things to change or he wants to give up his OP status. Like I truly believe that he still wants to keep all that. But in this moment, it's more so like he wants to know the truth as well. But also when he brings this up, the Blur mentions the strange things that he had seen in the Dread Dimension, where it appears that this reality was like stitched together, and Dr. Spectrum, he shoots it down like everything's weird in the Dread Dimension, like that don't count. But also with Dr. Spectrum saying this, like we know that he has his concerns, or at least had his concerns at one point when he expressed them to President Phil Coulson. But then it's here where everyone on the Squadron Supreme notices that Nighthawk is just being extra quiet, and because of this, Hyperion asks him like, hey man, like just tell me something, tell me I'm not crazy. And in response, Nighthawk then asked Hyperion in his best Batman voice, where exactly in the Arctic was this? Which from there leads us to seeing the whole squadron splitting up and investigating the different anomalies, if you will, that they discovered in a number of different locations. Which first takes us over to Dr. Spectrum and the Blur, who go up to the Arctic to investigate the location where Captain America was. And they do discover that a body was there, but also Dr. Spectrum, he notices that there is an alien signature, but he just presumes that that alien signatures that he's picking up, that it had just come from Hyperion when he was there. But then after this, when we jump over to Hyperion, we come to find out that he has found Rocket's ship. And with seeing this, once again, I can't help it, I'm getting Man of Steel vibes again. And possibly because it starts with him tearing his way out of the ship, but who knows. But with finding the ship, he tells the rest of the squadron, like, I found the ship that belonged to that raccoon who almost murdered Dr. Spectrum. And Dr. Spectrum chimes in like, hey, it was a heavily armed raccoon. Like, let's make that clear. But with Hyperion finding the ship here, like, we know it's outside of Earth because Brandy Selby, the Star Brand baby, she had asked Groot to bring her to Earth, to where not long after Okoye found them and they followed her ship back to Earth to where they went to Wakanda. But when Hyperion finds the ship, he destroys it with finding no one inside and nothing to really point to any evidence that this is connected to the Avengers. But then from here, next we go over to Nighthawk and Zarda, the Power Princess, to where initially you kind of have this back and forth with Nighthawk telling Zarda, like, you know Hyperion doesn't like the two of us alone, right? And Zarda tells Nighthawk that she's told him a bunch of times that it wouldn't work between the two of them because she would crush him like a sack of twigs. And at that point, Nighthawk's like, hey, well, let's get it cracking. No, I'm just playing, he ain't say that. But while they're here, Nighthawk is showing Zarda the security footage which we saw him retrieve from Ravencroft Asylum in Heroes Reborn number 5. But while looking over this footage, the first thing that stands out is Captain America's shield. But then Nighthawk points out to Zarda that along with them, there's also Echo and she's the Phoenix, which immediately reminds Zarda of her encounter with Jean Grey when she was the Phoenix, which we got a glimpse of in Heroes Reborn number 6. But then it's here where Zarda mentions that she tore Jean to pieces and flew each piece to a different corner of the cosmos, which is so messed up. But then on top of this, we get a bit more information because in the aftermath of the Heroes Reborn Phoenix saga, I guess, but it was after Jean was killed to where Wolverine, or just Weapon X here, along with Final Flight, who's like this world's version of Alpha Flight, they came after the Squadron Supreme, and Wolverine, or Weapon X, who had his claws enhanced with shaman magic, killed Hyperion, which in this world very much felt like the death of Superman. And with Zarda thinking back on this, it's not only because she had saw the Phoenix again, but it's also because Nighthawk mentions that they both know what dies doesn't always stay dead. Because later, much like Superman, Hyperion had came back, which is a story we see within the Heroes Reborn one-shot, Weapon X, and Final Flight, because when Hyperion came back, not only did he beat the brakes off of Weapon X, to where then after, he fried him with his solar vision, which by the way, still didn't kill Weapon X. But with Hyperion doing this for the revenge of his own death, the Squadron Supreme, like, they did Logan dirty. Because after Hyperion fried him, he then told Dr. Spectrum to just take him, and from there, Dr. Spectrum took Logan to the Black Galaxy on a long dead planet, and he just left him there, where there was no oxygen, no water, no kind of sustenance, to where Logan would forever be in this endless loop where his healing factor just wouldn't allow him to die. And ever since that happened, all the way up to this moment, like, that's where Logan has been. And it's nuts, because the whole time we've been talking about Heroes Reborn and the Squadron Supreme of America and how much dirt they've done within this universe, and to me it just feels like from what we've seen, they've done the X-Men and the mutants like the worst out of everybody. But then it's here where we jump over to Nighthawk and Dr. Spectrum, to where Nighthawk lets Dr. Spectrum know that the alien signatures that he had found in the Arctic, that they weren't Hyperions, but instead the signature matches some meteorites which were found by an old arms dealer by the name of Howard Stark, to where when Nighthawk discovered this, he put it together with his suspicions from Heroes Reborn number 5, and with all this information he comes to the conclusion that the stories of Wakanda are actually real. But he doesn't go into all of that with Dr. Spectrum, but instead he just tells Dr. Spectrum to scan every corner of Africa because he believes that their next answer is hidden there. And so after this, we then go over to Ravencroft Asylum, where we find Zarda and the Blur, who are paying Norman Osborn a visit, who, like we'd seen before, he's like this universe's version of the Joker. But with Zarda and the Blur coming here, they come to ask Norman who helped Echo escape. But with him being very cryptic and not giving them direct answers, it's here where Norman mentions that he more or less talked the Silver Witch into killing herself, with her cells shorting out during the recent riot, to where after that he was just whispering to her in the dark, and as a result, the Silver Witch just hex blasted herself. But Norman then tells Zarda that he was only whispering or talking to Wanda, much like he's talking to Zarda now. And with doing this, he very much taunts Zarda, asking her if talking to her now makes her want to kill herself, and he lets her know that is the only way she could be reunited with the other Utopians, who we had seen in Magneto and the Mutant Force. The other Utopians were killed because Zarda brought back a virus from the world back to Utopia Isle, which practically makes it her fault that they're gone. And when he says this, Zarda jumps through the glass of Norman's cell, and all I can hear is the music in the back, like dee 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 dee. as she literally chokes the life out of him. And this time I think he's dead, like for real. Because after doing this, Zarda, she's then like, she doesn't understand how Nighthawk could keep all these villains alive for so long and how he puts up with his precious rogues gallery. And when she says this, we get a flashback to a moment when Norman Osborn had ran for president, to where with doing so, we got this world's version of the Dark Avengers, which in this case were called the Dark Squadron, to where amongst them we got the Sentry, Nova, Moon Knight, Valkyrie, and the Ghost Runner. And they're looking pretty sick, especially Nova. And even with seeing this, like in a way, I kind of want to get like a Dark Reign or a Heroes Reborn version of Dark Reign, but then also with just knowing how OP the Squadron Supreme are, like I'm also skeptical of how good that would pan out to be. But with getting back to present day, Nighthawk, he brings the information to the rest of the squadron, and it stirs up an argument between the big three, which are Nighthawk, Hyperion, and Power Princess. Because Nighthawk wants the Squadron Supreme of America to move forward on Wakanda without letting President Coulson know. But for Dr. Spectrum and the Blur, who are kind of watching from a distance, because arguments between the big three, they can get kind of messy, or better yet destructive, but because of this they just watch from a distance. But while they're listening to the big three go back and forth, President Coulson is also listening in to them, and because of that he knows what they're about to do. But then while we're here in Washington DC, we then get this moment where the Blur and Dr. Spectrum, they visit the Fury Monument, like while they're waiting for the big three to sort things out, but they head here like initially on the conversation of simpler times. But then while they're here, Dr. Spectrum, he suggests that the Blur just goes back in time so that they can just have a drink with previous President Fury and perhaps even win the Vietnam War. But then it's here where the Blur tells Dr. Spectrum that him going back in time and changing things, that it doesn't always work well for him. And when the Blur says this, we get like this flashback to the Blur's version of, I guess, Flashpoint mixed with Spider-Man One More Day, which I guess kind of works perfectly, like if the Blur had to give up Mary Jane in a similar way to Barry Allen, like accepting the loss of his mother. But regardless of how this played out, what we do know for sure is that Mephisto is just having a blast over here. But then after seeing this, we then jump over back to present day in the African safari, in a location to where Dr. Prism has figured that whatever Nighthawk is looking for, that it would generally be in this area. And even though Hyperion can't necessarily see anything different with his atomic vision, the Blur notices that he can't run through a certain area, and Zarda can also feel that there's great power like in this area. And essentially Nighthawk has noticed that the readings from the Phoenix, the energy signature from the Star Brand, the atmospheric disturbances from Zarda's encounter with Thor, and the trail from the Daywalker, like they all lead here. And with Nighthawk finding this place, Zarda suggests that they strike before the Wakandans or whoever is aware of their presence. But as soon as she says that, the Wakandan shield opens up and out come the Avengers, who at this point are ready to fight and take their reality back. But before we get into the beginning of this face-off, it's here we go back to President Phil Coulson, who, like we've seen before, he's aware of what the Squadron Supreme of America are doing. But while he's playing back the conversation to where the squadron is like, we're moving ahead, without telling the president to give him plausible deniability, but when he plays it back here, it's also heard by Vice President Thunderbolt Ross and the House Press Secretary J. Jonah Jameson. And when they hear this, like on one hand you have Vice President Ross, who responds like he wants to start his own version of the Thunderbolts to back up the squadron, and on the other hand you have Press Secretary Jameson, who wants to put out the news that the Squadron Supreme of America are like a bunch of menaces, but President Phil Coulson's not having that, so he just shoots the both of them. And just like that, Thunderbolt Ross and J. Jonah Jameson are done. But then immediately after, President Coulson covers it up by saying the two of them were assassinated by sleeper agents from Wakanda. Which is also crazy because when that lie gets out, the bigger focus is going to be on like, what? Wakanda's real? But then also when this happens, Mephisto shows up and he assures President Coulson that he had did the right thing, because the more people that say the A word, or the more people who know about the Avengers, that then begins to compromise this world that they've created. But then it's also here where Phil Coulson mentions that they may have missed a thing or two, but Mephisto then tells him like it's nothing that can't be rubbed out or forgotten again, which pretty much means kill Captain America. And when Mephisto asks President Coulson like how does he feel about doing that, or how does the idea of killing Captain America make him feel, and President Coulson's like, I never should have left them alive in the ice, as he shoots either Jameson or Thunderbolt Ross as he hears them moaning and still alive. But at this point, with finding a way to resolve this, President Coulson can't necessarily just call back the squadron because their interest has been piqued already. And on top of that, if the squadron changes sides or they're defeated by the Avengers, then this entire reality will be compromised. But then it's here where President Coulson mentions to Mephisto that he had told him that they would have help with keeping all this together. And Mephisto responds by telling President Coulson that that the council won't commit because they still don't trust him, and that's why he's not getting the assistance that he anticipated, which is an interesting mention. But with hearing this President Coulson, he suggests that they make things right in order to win over the council, which is something that can't be done by bombing Wakanda because it'll bring too much attention, and once again he can't call back the squadron because that could backfire. And it's here where President Coulson says that the only way to handle this is to do it the same way that he remade this world in Mephisto's image, which is by using the Pandemonium Cube. And with seeing this, I can't help but think, and I may be way off with this one, but this cube very much reminds me of the Tesseract that was made by Reed Richards in the 1610 before he became the maker. But then also hearing Mephisto talking about the council, which then has me thinking of the Council of Reeds, and it just has ideas swirling through my mind left and right, especially with Mephisto stealing a symbiote at the end of King in Black within the Ghost Rider tie-in. So who knows where all this is going? But wherever it's going, there's a lot of strong potential leads in a number of different directions. So for now, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Alright, so before we get into Heroes Return, I wanted to get into a bit more of the backstory of Phil Coulson and the road leading him into this narrative. Because when Heroes Reborn had first began, it had more or less just hit the ground running without much of any references to Avengers Volume 8, which I already pointed out on the Heroes Reborn playlist. But to clear it up a bit more, I wanted to jump back to Deadpool issue 31 so that we could tie together the recent story of Phil Coulson's hatred for the Avengers. Because back in Volume 6 of Deadpool issue 31, Jerry Duggan had given us this narrative which takes place before Secret Empire issue 0, to where at the time your Cosmic Cube Cap, he had called in Deadpool to kill Phil Coulson, who had discovered at the time that Steve Rogers wasn't exactly who he had claimed to be. And even though Coulson didn't have like the full story because that would have been a huge spoiler at the time, but he had enough to compromise what was in the works, and he was getting ready to blow the whistle. And with Cosmic Cube Cap calling in Deadpool to pull this off, it was one of those things to where Deadpool, on one hand, he didn't really question Captain America because that was his hero, and he convinced Deadpool that he was doing a service for his country. But then again, when it comes to hiring Deadpool for a hit, he's really not that hard to convince. But in the case of him going after Phil Coulson, after shooting down Lola, Coulson had then made his way on foot to a nearby off-the-book safe house that he had inherited from Nick Fury that was also equipped with a safe room. But the thing about safe rooms, like, they're only really safe if you can get that door shut. And in this instance, when Coulson got in, Deadpool caught up with him just in time to get an arm inside the door before he could close it. And even though Coulson tried to plead with him and tell him he was on the wrong side, but with hearing this, Wade didn't listen, because how could the wrong side be Captain America's side? And with that little space he created through that open door, Deadpool reached around and put one in Phil Coulson's chest, effectively completing his mission and killing Phil Coulson with death by reach around. But then after this, when we go over to Avengers Volume 8, Issue 10, it's towards the end of that issue where we get the surprise reappearance of Phil Coulson, to where he just pops up and he pays General Ross a visit, telling him that he has a solution that'll step in to where both S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers failed. And General Ross at the time was like, hey, I don't know how you here, but as long as you handed me a W, I'll take it. But with this pop-up return of Phil Coulson, this is where we initially got the introduction of the Squadron Supreme as the Squadron Supreme of America. And as far as the details of Coulson's deal with Mephisto, those would be later unpacked over the course of time. And as far as like what we know from this moment throughout the rest of Avengers Volume 8 up until Heroes Reborn, I've already just sprinkled those details throughout the Heroes Reborn playlist, but even still, I just wanted to go back and add a bit more context for those who were either asking how Phil Coulson died or where this really started. But from here, going into Heroes Return Issue 1, it's here where we see President Phil Coulson, who's taken down Peter Parker, The Thing, and Reed Richards, who had initially came to him about unusual energy readings, but much like we had seen President Coulson do with General Ross and J. Jonah Jameson, he gets them out of the way in order to keep the secrets of this world under wraps, which for the record is exactly why he got killed in the first place, heading into Secret Empire. But after this, we see President Coulson head over to Wakanda with a couple of fighter jets who he's already ordered to drop payloads on the Avengers and the Squadron Supreme of America if they're in the way, saying that even if a few of the members of the squadron die, it's not the end of the world. And on the surface, it may seem like President Coulson's either going on this killing spree or he's just like, let whoever die, whatever. But you also have the case of him heading to Wakanda with the Pandemonium Cube, with every intention of rewriting this reality after the Avengers are defeated. But after this, when we then jump over to Wakanda and we just jump right into the fight between Hyperion and Thor, and off top, Hyperion is like, you're the guy who vomited on my girlfriend. And when he says that, Thor is like, man, you're gonna have to narrow it down a little bit, you gotta be more specific. Cause I guess over the ages, Thor has just vomited on a lot of girlfriends. But with going back and forth between a lot of these fights, there's a lot of buffs and peculiar twists that are going on. Because for one, you have Maya Lopez, who is the Phoenix, going up against Zarda, and Zarda just runs through these flames like it's nothing. And in another matchup, you got Dr. Spectrum, who's going against Brandy, the Star Brand baby. And this matchup I kinda like, because Dr. Spectrum, he's like, okay, I don't fight kids, even if they have the Star Brand. But then cute little Brandy's like, I don't need you to fight, I just need you to cry when I break you. Cause she wants her revenge for him killing Rocket, but even seeing her seek vengeance, like, it's adorable. But then after this, we got Black Panther going up against the Blur, but because T'Challa's not a literal speedster, he does have to get a little bit crafty in order to either catch the Blur when he's running circles around him, or use his Panther-like speed in order to keep up with the Blur. And with seeing this, like, it's pretty nuts how close T'Challa is able to keep up, and he expresses while doing this that Vibranium remembers what it's like to be a meteor, which then makes me just think of the whole G.I. Joe fast running suits thing. But with this happening and T'Challa being quick enough to just keep up with the Blur, he then gets up behind him and he just shreds the ligaments from the back of his legs. And with doing this, he lets the Blur know that he had intentionally done just enough damage that the Blur will be able to walk again. And when he does this, the Blur's devastated because he's like, man, without my legs, I'm nothing. And he tells T'Challa, like, I may crack jokes every now and then, but this is my life, man. This is my world. But then, like, on top of that, like, with him saying this is my world, it leans into the idea or the concept of these guys fighting to keep this reality the way it is. And as we take a look through all the different matchups, it's here where we get Blade versus Nighthawk, and with the way that Blade talks to Nighthawk, it sounds like he's talking to Batman. Because Blade tells him, like, I don't see why all your other teammates are afraid of you, and he tells him he sounds like a rich kid who just bought himself a rep, and that he probably just had one hard day in his life and just never got over it, versus someone like Blade who has had every day of his life hard for the past 100 years. But then on top of this, you also have Captain America, who's on his flying Wakandan bike, and he gets word from T'Challa that President Coulson is inbound with 2 fighter jets. And when he sees him, he tells the others that this guy's not truly the president and that he's gonna handle him himself. And when Cap heads in, it's here where we see Carol Danvers, who's in one of these jets. And as soon as she sees Cap, she's like, that's Captain America. And they're like, no, it's not. She's like, yes, it is. They're like, no, it's not. Yes, it is. And they try to tell her like Captain America was killed in action, so she's clear to engage. But even still, Carol Danvers doesn't follow these orders, which have trickled down from President Coulson, because she finds it suspicious that even in this world, and better yet, especially in this world, that someone would get the orders for her to shoot down anyone who's wearing an American flag, which then gives Cap the opportunity to take President Coulson head on. But then it's from here where we jump back to Thor versus Hyperion, to where while they're fighting, Hyperion notices that he's being drained once again. And while he's pounding on Thor and just telling him how America has enough gods we don't need anymore, but then it's here where Thor tells him like, you idiot, like this isn't America. And not just that, but it's because of what Wakanda is built upon, that is the thing that's making you weak. And as Thor continues to go in, he tells Hyperion, like a friend, like, you know, we all have our weaknesses, to where for Thor, his is mead and beer and wine and rum. But then as he smashes Hyperion through the ground into like this pit of vibranium, he then asks Hyperion like, can you guess what your weakness is? But then it's right after this where we then jump over to Brandy, who just destroys Dr. Spectrum's power prism with the Star Brand. And with his power prism destroyed, he's now useless, and because of that he just curls up and cries, which is exactly what Brandy wanted. But then just after this, when we go over to Maya Lopez, who is struggling up against Zarda, and mind you, Maya is the actual Phoenix, like the actual host of the real Phoenix. So that alone kind of tells you how powerful this Pandemonium Cube is, with it buffing this team to that extent. And an argument can also be made like if the Phoenix had a different host, then it could have been used in a more substantial way, because Zarda beating the Jean Grey of this world, like, that don't count. But an argument could be made that a different host might have done more, but on the flip side, we have seen the Phoenix Force take pushback from things like chaos magic, so it can go either way here. But regardless, Maya says she needs some help. But as we jump through all the different matchups, Nighthawk tells Blade that he knows who he is, which immediately lets Blade know like, okay, like you remember how it's supposed to be. And Nighthawk more or less tells him like, yeah, I figured it out, cause I'm Nighthawk. And with saying this, he leaves a Hawkerang in Blade's chest and he kicks off of him into a flip, just shocking the mess out of him. But from here, when we head back up to the sky with Captain America versus President Phil Coulson, it's here where we see Captain America realize that President Coulson is doing this with some hellish version of the Cosmic Cube. And with seeing this, like, it's here where Coulson has this villainish moment and he tells Cap about how the world has seen so much chaos since heroes like him in the Avengers, who he also calls the world's most overrated heroes. But for Coulson, who never wanted to be a hero, he had instead just replaced the Avengers with heroes that he had thought to be more majestic than what he says the Avengers could ever be, way, but for Coulson, who didn't want to be a hero, he took the position that he believes that everyone dreams about, which is the guy with the power to change the world in the palm of his hand. But in the middle of him giving this speech, he's clipped by Carol Danvers, who more or less just radios back like, oops, didn't see the guy. But as far as Maya, who was asking for help going up against Zarda, she then gets help from Brandy, and together they use the combined force of the Star Brand and the Phoenix Force to take Zarda down. And with doing so, Maya makes the reference that both the Phoenix Force and the Star Brand, they go way back, which is kind of like a shameless plug for Avengers 1 million. And from there, jumping back to Thor and Hyperion, like Hyperion is still swinging, and even at this point with him being weakened, he has enough strength to punch Thor into the clouds and out of the fight for a minute. And when this happens, we then see Blade, who's still coming after Nighthawk, but before he can do anything, he's zapped by Hyperion, who then hovers over to Nighthawk with the Batman Superman silhouettes, man, I can't help it. And on top of that, Zarda looks like she just got the Zack Snyder headbutt. But the thing is, like, in this moment here, like, they talk about Hyperion's weakness, which is vibranium, and we kind of picked that up already. But then on top of that, we then find out that the vibranium is supposed to be fragments of his home world, which is nuts, but he has been crafted around the whole Superman thing, so it makes sense. But also in addition, like we talked about before, with both Nighthawk and Hyperion having their differences, which for the most part were over Zarda, but it's here where they more or less put them to the side and they're like, hey, we're gonna do whatever it takes to keep this world intact. But then T'Challa just jumps into their moment and he tells them that he's not gonna let that happen. Not here, not while the Black Panther lives, which really felt like a Black Panther, as you can see, I'm not dead moment. But this is then interrupted by Captain America, who's been falling for the past 5 pages, which is also thanks to Carol Danvers for swooping in for the assist. But the way that this kind of fell in together, it played out nice, because with Hyperion being weakened by Wakanda for one, and then tussling with the Black Panther, who's in a vibranium suit on top of that, which just leans on his weakness even more. But right after Captain America crashes down, he then rushes towards him and he socks old Hyperion on the jaw, just knocking him out cold with that vibranium shield, which I feel like was that mysterious weakness that we were trying to figure out in Heroes Reborn issue 2, because long exposure to vibranium, it is a thing. But from here, Maya and Brandy, they use the Phoenix Force and the Star Brand to go after the Pandemonium Cube, and with doing so, trusting these primordial forces to handle the cube and set everything back the way it should be. But while they're over there cooking reality back to normal, Nighthawk then just has to get the word in like, I want y'all to remember I was the last man standing. Like, he really tells them, like, he wants them to remember that despite everything you did to stop us, in the end, I was still standing. But it's funny also because Thor's like, alright, we'll see after you catch this hammer one time. Like, we'll see about that. But in the case of President Phil Coulson, who survived the crash, he reaches out from the burning car reaching for the Pandemonium Cube, and while doing so, crying out to Mephisto like he did everything that he was told and it didn't work, but as this happens, he's incinerated and everything just fades to white. But with this happening, everything's then set back to normal, everyone's back at Avengers Mountain, and I mean everything's almost back to normal because now Brandy, she has the potty mouth after hanging around Rocket for too long. But after seeing this, we then make our rounds to the Squadron Supreme of America and seeing how they're coping with this world. And in the case of Hyperion, he goes to check on Peter Parker, who in Heroes Reborn was his close friend, but now that everything is fixed, when he goes to the Daily Bugle, he sees Spider-Man instead. And with seeing this, Hyperion then just flies off like, you're not the guy I used to know. But within this reformed world, there's no sign of Phil Coulson, and as far as the rest of the squadron that have been taken into custody, with the exception of Nighthawk, the evaluation has been made that these guys were just pawns. But out of everyone, the Blur and Dr. Spectrum, like, they've got it the worst. And it's almost like they've gone through desperation and just drifted into insanity. And especially the Blur, man, like, he is begging and pleading to be sent back. While Zarda, she's just flipping tables and fighting as usual. But then last but not least, when we get to Nighthawk, who also isn't ready to let go, by the way. And he's still convinced that the world that they came from, that it wasn't a mistake, because he says that world made sense, and the world will make sense again, even if he has to make that happen on his own. And like, with seeing that, either look out for that guy becoming a villain, or later coming to his senses and becoming Marvel's Batman. Or not. Like, Marvel about to throw him to the bottom of the stack. But after this, like, when we see the cube, the Pandemonium Cube, go back to Mephisto, we then get a glimpse of Phil Coulson paying the price for failing Mephisto. But then also here, when we see Mephisto speaking off of this ledge, and he says that all of this was about showing what the power of one Mephisto could do. And if it got that crazy with just one, imagine what 615 more could do. And it's here where we get the reveal of the council that Mephisto had mentioned before, which is the Council of Red, to where in total you have 616 Mephistos, 616, interesting number. But after everything throughout Heroes Reborn and Heroes Return, he says this was about bringing them all together from across the red gulfs between hells, and just making the example of what one could do to show the others. And with seeing this, like, who the hell knows what's gonna happen now? And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below, so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments about everything, like for Heroes Reborn, Heroes Return, because for me personally, I enjoyed it. It was just like a fun, wacky ride. And it's nice to see some of those every now and then, because some of this stuff may roll over into events in the future, like Mephisto in the Council of Red, and some of it may not, like Nighthawk. I got my money on Nighthawk. It's not gonna happen. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.